Welcome back to the Tradition Podcast. This is Jeffrey Sachs, the journal's editor. If you're not getting our quarterly journal of Jewish thought in your mailbox, now's the time to visit traditiononline.org and subscribe, or gift a subscription to someone in your life who should be reading Tradition, perhaps a younger person making their way into the world of Jewish learning and ideas. While you're at the website, peruse our archive, containing 62 years worth of articles, essays, and reviews, all open access. Before you turn off your computer or smartphone, jump over to Tradition Journal at Facebook and give us a like to keep updated on everything happening in our print journal and our digital platform. Tradition's recent fall 2020 issue was largely dedicated to a symposium on Mahashevet Yisrael, the educational challenges and goals of Jewish thought. This symposium was ably guest-edited by Mali Brofsky, and this is my chance to thank her for producing a stimulating issue and to let you know that Mali has now joined our editorial board, so you can expect to see more of her work in upcoming issues. Among the 11 essays in the symposium, we ran a piece by Rav Dov Singer. You can find it on our website. Rav Dov is the Rosh Yeshiva of the Makor Chaim High School in Gush Etzion, and the founder of the Beit Midrash Lehithadshut and its Lifnim educator training program. In his essay, Singer laid out the theory of how to educate towards spiritual connection and meaning. In this podcast, Mali Brofsky talks with Yehuda Chanales and Schindelheim, who've been working closely with Rav Dov in applying this process to the classroom in the Fuchs Mizrachi School in the Cleveland area, as part of a groundbreaking partnership with Yeshivat Makor Chaim in Israel to enhance the culture of personal and religious growth in the school. In the episode, they discuss the program outlined in Rav Dov's article, what the program really looks like in practice, the strengths and challenges of the suggested process, and how it is transforming the culture among both teachers and students alike. Rabbi Rick Schindelheim has taught Jewish studies at the Fuchs Mizrachi School since 2013. His informal educational experience includes over a decade of work at Camp Stone in a variety of capacities. He's a nationally certified school psychologist and holds a master's and special education specialist degree. Rabbi Yehuda Chanales is Director of Educational Advancement and a member of the Judaic faculties at Fuchs Mizrachi. He was formerly a faculty member at the TABC and MTA high schools, and is a 3-time graduate of Yeshiva University. He most recently completed a Certificate of Advanced Educational Leadership from Harvard. Here's their conversation.
What Rav Dov's article did, which I thought was really fascinating, was that it explicated his philosophy of education, right? It was an article that was grounded in how he defined Mahashevet Yisrael, but what he did was really lay out a description of how he thinks one can best, the truth is, let me leave that sentence blank, and maybe I'll have our two responders tell me what they think he thinks Rav Dov's goal is. But what I'll just kind of briefly outline, there are 4 steps to achieving that goal, which just to put the placeholder, I would say for Rav Dov is like achieving spiritual connection, maybe. I'll just leave that as kind of vague right there. So he basically talks about four levels. The first level I would call, and I actually as a student and teacher of mindfulness, I would just simply call it mindfulness. He talks about getting in touch with the self, learning how to be still, learning how to be calm, really learning how to kind of connect to your own inner voice and hearing it. The next step, the way I understand how I read his article, the next step is learning how to then engage in what I would call mindful communication, but deep communication with the other, where you really learn how to convey those inner truths and those inner experiences as best as you can to the other and really hear the other person's truth. And for that, you need to create a safe space in order to make room for that communication. The third level, for the way Rav Dov describes it in the article, is turning towards God, a community that then turns towards God, specifically in prayer. And finally, he talks about this level that he calls dveikut, which is ultimately striving towards at least some type of connection with God. So the truth is, as I was introducing this, I'm gonna turn to Rabbi Yehuda Chanales to fill us in on their work, because the Fuchs Mizrachi School in Cleveland has actually been working quite closely with Rav Dov, taking his system and actually putting it into practice in their school. We have also with us Rick Schindelheim, who is a teacher, who's going to also share with us the actual practical day-to-day experience in the classroom. And I would like to hear from both of you, first of all, how you started connecting with Rav Dov, and what drew you to this? Why did you, how did you, what impelled you to make this connection? How did it happen? And then just tell us a little bit about putting this into practice. But the truth is, before you do that, I just made the connection as I was speaking. Rav Dov this is a symposium on Mahashevet Yisrael, and Rav Dov kind of framed it as like, well, Mahashevet Yisrael shouldn't be learning about God. Mahashevet Yisrael should be connecting to God. So I'd like you both when you have a chance to also answer if you think this really is Mahashevet Yisrael, how this is Mahashevet Yisrael, and again, for us it's very exciting because the symposium, really one of the things we wanted to see was, does Mahashevet Yisrael affect the lived experience of those who teach it and those who learn it? And so obviously for you, that's one of the big goals is lived experience. So if you could relate to the Mahashevet Yisrael side of that, the lived experience side of that, and how it actually comes to life in the classroom. All right, Chanales.
Wow, thanks so much, Mali. It's really great to be able to have this conversation. And I appreciate the opportunity from Tradition. And really, when I saw the article in Tradition, I was super excited. Besides, the entire symposium, which I think raises a lot of interesting questions. For us, really today is the 2-year anniversary of our first encounter with Rav Dov when he first came and visited us in Cleveland, and we've been so immersed in the work and the direction and approach that he and his colleagues at Makor Chaim have been working with us on, that it's hard sometimes to articulate that to people who are not as immersed in the work. Especially because there's a bit of a language barrier, and so much of the beauty and power of what Rav Dov has to offer is his language and the way in which he expresses things. Figuring out how to translate that, as you yourself alluded to, and trying to, struggling to articulate exactly what the goal is, what is he trying to achieve. And I think that this article is the best articulation in English that I've seen so far. And kudos to the translators and to the editors. I'm sure it was not an easy job. At really articulating the power of what Rav Dov is after. And maybe I'll start with that.
Mm-hmm. Great.
So I think to me, the goal and the lines that stand out most from the article in articulating what Rav Dov is after and what he's trying to do is the title, the idea of Avodat Hashem, as being a field, as being a discipline, as being something that is teachable, and something that we should look at as something that can develop on its own. In further in the article, Rav Dov refers to it as developing spiritual intelligence, and just I'll quote one line that I think articulates it so well. Right, there's a spiritual intelligence that helps us perceive that which is hidden and awesome. The human intelligence that is sensitive to the notion that things have an inner essence and need to be deeply intuited. The intelligence that helps a person use introspection to understand and perceive. Right, and for a lot of us, right, as teachers in schools, as educators in schools, who spend so much of our time focused on talking to students' minds and sharing our own ideas and our own minds with them, Rav Dov is speaking to something different, right, to a different way of thinking, and to me, I think his bigger chiddush is, and ultimately what drew us and Mizrachi to working with him, is that this is a skill. And this is something that can be worked on, and that if you can engage with teachers and with students in a process that will help improve, right, students and teachers and really adults in the community's ability, right, to achieve those goals.
Which is what? What are the goals? I'm putting you on the spot, but
sure. I think overarching, right, it's to talk to God. Mm-hmm. Right, to have an experience of God and not just learn about it. right? When it comes to our relationship to Torah, which is really what we as educators are thinking the most about, it's not just about how can we convey inspiring ideas and make sure that students connect with the ideas of Torah and the text of Torah, but also that has a deep impact on how they see themselves personally and how they experience, right, their lives and their connection with HaKadosh Baruch Hu within their life. And I think that's kind of part of the second part of the question that you raised. And feel free to stop me at any point.
No, go ahead. I'd like to hear really how you're implementing it in the school. Like, what does this look like in the classroom? Like, again, like I went through these 4 steps, and Rav Dov talks about how you teach these 4 steps, but each one is a tremendous challenge. It's not simple. So I'm interested in hearing how practically you make this happen, because I do think it's a tremendous shift. It's a tremendous shift from, I think you're right, from learning cognitively to experiencing.
And I think it's not just a shift for students, it's also a shift for teachers, and that has been a huge part of the work. One of the phrases that the Makor Chaim people like to use a lot is "Lifgosh et atzmecha kedei lifgosh et talmidecha," right? To encounter yourself in order to be able to better encounter your students, and a large, we learned very quickly before our work with Rav Dov that if we wanted teachers to teach differently and to ask different kinds of questions when they're in the classroom and when they're teaching Tanakh and Gemara than what they learned in yeshiva, so they have to learn differently first. And that's what led us to, and we're very grateful to the JEIC, the Jewish Education Innovation Challenge, that gave us an initial grant, right, to bring teachers together over summers to learn together, right, to ask different questions of each other. And Rav Dov came in further that and said that if you want to ultimately have students not just bring their minds, but bring their hearts, their leiv to the classroom, then you have to make sure that you as teachers are doing that also. And there's work that has to be done in that regard. And from that perspective, the shift was it's not just a program, right? It's not just follow step A, step B, step C, and then you'll be successful. It was a mind shift for us. It was a shift from la'asot, from an approach to what we're doing in school as what we're doing, to asking ourselves how we're being. The first time Rav Dov came, he likes to play on words quite a bit, Hebrew English words, and he called us all loserim. He said, "I see a lot of loserim," and he was playing off of the Hebrew word of luz, which means a schedule. And he noticed the 3 days that we're here, just how everything is driven by the schedule and what's next on the schedule. And the critique, which we really took to heart, was, how do we take a step back from, the period ending at 9:52 and moving to the next one at 9:54 and preparing for tomorrow's test and grading the tests and moving to one thing to the next, just taking a step back and creating space within school for ourselves as teachers and for students to just be.
Right. So I think creating space is a really important phrase. I think that's probably one of the tenets of Rav Dov's, of this philosophy, right? It's like creating space to see yourself, creating space to see the other. Do you find though that there are some specific steps? Like I would like to hear like what this means I'm pushing you. Maybe the answer is there aren't really steps and it's more about a frame of mind. But I am curious about that. Like did Rav Dov give you, or did you create, maybe even, beyond what he gave you, did he give you any guidelines about how to do this? Like that's really a question that I find interesting, because I agree that so much of this is a paradigm shift. And yet I also think that people find it extremely helpful to have some type of a framework to follow. So I'd love to hear from you if there is any type of structure, what that would.
Absolutely. Yeah. And maybe Rick will speak a little bit more towards some of the structures that we started working on. Mm-hmm. But that's ultimately what convinced us that we need to continue to do the work, because Rav Dov didn't just say you need to change your mindset. He said, I have an approach, I have structures, and I've even developed a master's program to train teachers, right, to do this. So for us, the first step was the work with teachers. And maybe Rick, maybe want to talk a little bit more about our Chaburat Zevet, our kind of.
Okay, so you had like a teacher. So Rick, I'd love to hear about that, and then I really want to hear about what you did in the classroom, and I'd love to hear about the impact on teenagers, because there are studies done. I remember hearing eminent psychologists talking about spirituality and the life cycle, and they said the low point for spirituality is the teenage years. So here you guys are being challenged to create some type of spirituality and religious sense with young people who are in a stage of life in which that's not really very high on their natural ladder of normal experiences. So yeah, Rick, I'd love to hear about the teacher's chabura, and then I really would love to hear about how this plays out in the classroom and how you make this real for students.
Yeah, I'll just jump on the second one for just very quickly because I don't forget. One of the most validating parts of this was hearing from Yishai Zinger of Dov's son when we were kind of commiserating about that challenge specifically when it comes to 10th graders. And to hear from someone in Makor Chaim saying, yeah, 10th grade is the hardest year was so validating just for my experience as a teacher of 10th graders and remembering my own experience as a 10th grade boy, going to day school in New York, going to Yeshiva school in New York. So that was very validating. In terms of the practical things, so there's I would break it into two parts, right? So there's like what Yehuda is saying, there are things that we've worked into the schedule. But at the same time, there's also this challenge of once, it's not just about putting something in the schedule, it's about taking concrete steps. And so some of the concrete things are the language that we use. And some of the concrete things are specific strategies that we implement in the classroom, which I guess relates to your second question. So we'll talk about the Chaburat Zevet that we do is bi-weekly. So every other week we meet as a Zevet, the Judaic faculty, we meet and we do this. We don't talk about it, we do it. We do the avodah, this avodat pnim, this internal work.
So what does that look like? Yeah.
So we start out where we'll go around, we'll do kind of a check-in. A lot of what we talk about a lot is our number of our presence, our mispar nochachut. So on a scale of 1 to 10, how present do you feel that you are? And again, that relates very much to the mindfulness thing. And just this process of taking a few moments to ask ourselves, how present are we right now? That in itself was a big learning experience because we very rarely before this ever thought about that. We just go from thing to thing and, where is my mind on, my kids, going to the doctor later or, this thing's going on or this conversation I had with the student last class and I'm bringing that into my next class with me. And just being aware of that, not necessarily for the sake of changing it, but just to be aware of it itself. We often find that it raises our level of presence just to go around and to see where are you right now. And we've translated that into the classroom. Not all of us do that every single day with every student, but we'll do various techniques where what Rav Dov will call kind of checking the air level of air pollution in the room, right? What's if I'm trying to speak to my students, we're trying to have some kind of interaction, whether it's about a pasuk or whether it's about a Rashi or a Sugya and Gemara, knowing what is in the air, what are they experiencing right now? What's going on with them? That's very helpful. If they say they're a 2, that doesn't mean I say, oh, you're only a 2, forget it, go to sleep or, leave the room or something like that. But that's very helpful for me to be aware of that. And it comes with this self-understanding also, which was a big piece of being able to separate if a kid's not paying attention or if a kid's not engaged. It's a lot of it, that self-awareness piece was a big part for all of us to learn about making it. It's very hard for us to not take it really personally when kids aren't, because we're so personally invested. But once we start to realize that it's not about us, right? We, of course, are personally invested, but if a kid's not engaged, it's not, I can make up a story in my head. Well, clearly he hates Torah and clearly that must be because I'm not a good teacher. So I have, I've chosen this career and I'm worthless, right? We do this whole thing in our head when actually, he was up really late last night because of this or that, and he's not engaged, but it's not because of me, and I'm going to invite him. And if he comes, then fantastic. And if he doesn't, and that in itself is a big part of it. So that's not something in the schedule. That's not I can point to a specific thing in the process, but that's part of what Rav Dov calls the Eish Shchora al Eish Levana, right? That the Torah is written with, there's the letters, but there's also the Torah, the context that the Torah comes in. And that context is developed in our relationships in the hallway with students, before the bell rings, as kids are coming into the classroom, hey, how's it going? Like a lot of times I think class starts when I start teaching. But really, class starts when that interaction happens, and that the content is laid on top of this mifgash that we call, right? This relationship, this connection, and then that's in the background all the time. But back to those tzavet meetings. So we'll start out, we'll do this, where are we? And maybe we'll add in a sipor lahayom, like what's going on with me? And that just does this thing of turning this into a chavura. We're connected, we're together, we're not in this alone. It develops towards building trust. And then we'll have the avodah part is we'll take a piece of Torah, whether it's something from the Parsha, whether it's something from Rabbi Nachman, whether it's anything, and then we'll, instead of, like you said, leaving it as a cognitive learning experience, we'll usually break off into partners, and we'll first write down. Writing is a big piece of this. And this is also something that we pretty much all translate into the classroom. Is it's not enough to ask a question. You got to go through the process of writing, and something I work very hard to convince my students that it's worthwhile. Like, why do I have to write it? I could just say it, or I could.
Why do you think that is? Just out of curiosity, for both, for yourself and for your students, what's the value of the writing? Is it a self?
Writing makes it more concrete, and very often I'll ask students. We'll always ask students, what do we learn about ourselves through this? Right? When we're asking a question like this, what do we learn about ourselves? And very often, once you start writing, you end up writing a lot more. I mean, I see this in classes all the time, in Jewish history and in Tanakh and there's a lot of research in education in general that shows that. So writing is a big part of it because it concretizes our thoughts and forces us, putting pen to paper, forces us to really develop the thoughts. Then we'll discuss in pairs. We'll break off into partners. So, for example, one of the questions that Yehuda asked a year plus ago, which is something that it was like I thought was a great question that really stuck with me, was this idea. It was before Rosh Hashanah. We were talking about the mitzvah lishmoa kol shofar, but also the concept of tkiyat shofar. So there's this duality, right? We're blowing the shofar, like something from our inside is going out into the world, and there's also lishmoa kol shofar. So Yehuda broke that into what are some things that I can be blowing out. I can be, what's my tkiyah? I can be giving to the world more, that I really want to be thinking about what's important to me, and what do I want to be working on that I can be sending out to the world, and what's my lishmoa? What do I need to be listening to more? What aspects of my life do I need to be listening? And then we'll discuss that, and we'll talk about what I learn about myself. Which are asking questions like this, and I see this from students all the time, where because we asked the question, they thought about it, and then they come up with this really profound thoughts, and I'll ask them, what did you learn about yourselves? And we're talking about 12th grade boys in a modern Orthodox school, and their responses often, not always, for sure not always, but often really they blow me away. Just in terms of, like, they're not saying it because they need to tell me. They're not getting graded on this, and many times they know they can say, I don't know, nothing, I don't know, because many of them do. But the times when they'll say things that are just incredibly insightful, I'm floored.
Okay, so I have another question. I have two more questions, but I'd say here's my first question, then my second question. My first question is, so everything you've said is basically, sounds to me very, very mindful, very self-aware, very relationship-based. What makes it uniquely Mahashevet Yisrael? Or, I mean, I think Rav Dov, I would call it neo-Chassidut, right? There's something very in line with Chassidut, the being in tune with the self, the being in tune not just with the cognitive, but also with the emotional, the impact of the community, right? So I would definitely put it in that category. I'm pushing to wonder, is there something uniquely spiritual about this, or are we just taking a discipline, right, a set of skills, and then because we're applying it to our own texts or to our own experience, that's what makes it, like, I feel like if I asked Rav Dov, he would push back at me and say, no, the entire thing is intrinsically like a religious, pathway. But I'm curious about what you think about that. Like, is it really just because you're applying it to the text, or is there something inherently either spiritual or even Jewish about this, which is a challenging question. I may know that I'm asking you a challenging question, so I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I'd like to hear from both of you.
I love challenging questions.
Yeah.
I don't know what Rav Dov would say. And we actually, Yehuda and I can talk about, we just had this conversation 2 days ago. We were talking about this exact question about what makes it Jewish. One of the things that I think makes this not controversial at all, and people who, might be, consider themselves, I'm not a neo-Chassid, or as the Rav Dov points out, a litvak. Rav Dov told us a joke. A litvak wears his gartel over here, right, to separate the moach from the leiv, as opposed to a Chassid, right? So I'm a litvak. I've never taught Rabbi Nachman in my class. I don't know much Rabbi Nachman. I've never learned Rabbi Nachman. I've never taught Reb Tzadok in my class. I'm excited from hearing David Bashefkin talk about it. I'm excited to learn about it, but that's not something that and so you could say then there's nothing specifically what you would call Hasidic or whatever about it. But I think that's part of what makes this very not controversial, less so than what people might think, which is the question of being mindful and thinking about, are we not talking about Mahashevet Yisrael, but actually doing it? Is in my classes, I'm still teaching, it's similar to what you're talking about in the podcast with Dr. Reinhold and with Dov Singer. I'm still teaching Rav Soloveitchik. I'm still teaching, it's Psukim and Rashis and Rav Soloveitchik and Nechama Leibowitz. And it's a lot of, but the question is when we learn a Sefer HaChinuch, it's how do you go that next step, right? I've taught Acharei HaPulot Nimshachim Alavavot for years. But then the question is, how do I take that and not just learn this as an idea in the abstract, but okay, so now let's think, all of us on our own, where do you want your lave to be going? And what's an example of a pu'ulah that you can do that can pull your lave? And what's getting in your way, right? So it's digging deeper. I don't know, maybe the argument is that it's not, it is universal. And I don't know that there's necessarily anything that takes that away. Meaning if a literature class, and if you read Rav Lichtenstein, if a literature class, you would do the same work, I would say that certainly is valuable. That I would say if you would read Shakespeare and you would really dig into what is this, how does this make me a better person? I don't think that lowers the level of Kedusha, of the things, the Torah that we're learning. Yeah. I think that there's value in really digging deep into what we're learning.
Yeah, and I think that's called spiritual reading. I think Henri Nouwen calls that reading spiritually. When you're not just reading, I think his words are, I'm not just looking what the words say, but what the words say to me. So it's the approach, right, that elevates it. Yehuda, what do you think about that question? What makes this, is there anything that makes this uniquely Jewish? Is it the approach? And I also like that idea that Rick said about Dr. Reinhold's point, which was what grounds Mahashevet Yisrael is so authentic for generations that we always use in the same text. So maybe just coming to it with a different approach and therefore taking it a step further, that's what this is, but that's a strength rather than, like I was posing it as like a challenge.
I think,
yeah, Yehuda.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that Rick said. I think I would formulate it as, I think there's a layer of preparation for, right? Meaning that you can look at the first stages of what Rav Dov talks about in the article in terms of self-awareness and building group dynamics and building trust and vulnerability as just a hechitimtza, as a way of getting to, right, deeper conversations about the text of Torah or deeper feelings during tefillah. I think Rav Dov would say that those first stages are also religious and are also just part of our avodat Hashem, meaning being more self-aware, being more connected to our feelings, to our experience of the world around us, to our connection with the people, right? And to make sure that when we're having a conversation with someone, that conversation is milev lelev, from one heart to another, and is authentic and is real. I think he would say that itself is something that is part of avodat Hashem and something that itself is religious. And the fact that, I've become a big fan of the work of Bob Keegan and Lisa Leahy from Harvard. The fact that they talk about the mindfulness and vulnerability and authenticity as being important for businesses, for profitability, in their book In Everybody Culture, which is a fantastic read. So that doesn't take away from the fact that I believe, right, that those practices are spiritual also. And part of what I think is so critical is the language that we use and the way that we frame things. Meaning, if those types of conversations are happening in Limudei Kodesh classes, right, in the framework of Torah learning, or in the framework of a conversation that a teacher is having with a student about their religious questions and their challenges, right? And right, the language that they're using, even for us, just the fact that it's Hebrew, or it already gives it a latent kind of religious feel. So that frames it and makes it a religious experience.
That's beautiful. And I think that's really true. And I think that there is legitimacy to just saying, well, what we're trying to do here is not to talk about a religious experience, it's to have a religious experience. And that this language and all of this facilitates getting to that religious experience. And maybe the texts themselves that's what they're there for as well. Learn.
think,
It's about reaching that goal, and that's what this is all trying to achieve. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think going back to something that was mentioned before, what you're talking about, so much of what we've learned is how to ask questions. And how to, we started by talking about creating that space. So much of creating the space for students is asking them questions that really push them to dig deeper and to think about and reflect on, what do they really feel? What are they really thinking about this? And I think that when we think about Mahashevet Yisrael, I was at the Prisma conference a couple of years ago and sitting with a really incredible group of educators, a bunch of Yeshiva high school leaders. And the question that was being discussed was, how do we basically ensure that religious identity and frumkeit and connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu is a lifelong part of our students? Or what can we do in high school to ensure that? And so many of the answers were about, well, we need to give them more chasidus. We need to give them more machshava. We need to give them more tishes and more onegs. And I think those are all great. And we need to think about how to do that and how to fit that all in the same hours of the day that we currently give them Tanakh and Gemara and everything else. But I think we need to be asking another question, which is, how can we create opportunities for students to bring themselves, right, and connect with whatever it is that they're learning? And that's why I think Rav Dov's article has a great place and in the Mahashevet Yisrael symposium, because it's saying I could be teaching Gemara, I could be teaching Tanakh, I could be teaching Rambam, I could be teaching Rabbi Nachman, and it's not about the text that I'm teaching. It's about, how am I asking students, right, to think deeply about, what is this text really saying, and what is it really saying to me?
That's beautiful. I think that's also, that was, you mentioned Dov Singer before, but that was Dov Singer's point, right? He's like, I don't care what you teach. I think that if you learn it in this way, it's Mahashevet Yisrael. Okay, so I'm gonna ask you one final question, which is also, I've really been throwing tough questions at you. Can you still hear me? Yeah. Okay.
All right, that was just the 1037 bell.
Oh, I was like, was that my mic going off? Okay. All right. This is how I'm going to ask it. So here in Israel, I think Rav Dov's whole approach is it's much more organic to the culture. I think it's very popular. I think it's almost second nature to our kids in Israel. This whole way of being, and so therefore, when I think about this whole approach, when I think about challenges, I think about the challenges that this approach poses to I think our youth. As I said this to Yehuda briefly before, or I alluded to it. I think you have challenges of, I'll say it in extreme language, but narcissism and postmodern relativism. Because if everything becomes about the self and the individual experience, even if that's an individual spiritual experience or individual religious experience, it becomes very, again, self-focused and not always necessarily grounded in some type of outer objective truth, which some might not say is a problem, but to me, that's where the question marks arise. And I think that's a lot of what our youth is grappling with in terms of, and just from a purely like halachic perspective, what do you need halacha for if it's all about the spiritual experience? And you can think about Rav Vital, going crazy about, it's not all about your own chavayad. It should be about, service of God in a more objective way. So I think that to me is the Israeli challenge. We've got it. We've got the everybody's tuned into themselves. Everybody's tuned into spirituality. The dangers, again, are you too tuned into yourself? So my question for you is, what are your challenges? Because I imagine that the American scene is quite different, and that your challenges are quite different. So the final question I would ask you are what are the challenges of this approach? Like, where do you find, what are potential challenges, pitfalls, difficulties of this work? I won't ask you necessarily how to overcome them, because that would be like a whole other podcast. But if you have a quick 1 sentence solution, I would love to hear it. But I am curious about that, right? Just to kind of round out the picture. Where are the difficulties? What do you find again more challenging pieces of this?
So for us culturally, there is a big difference in terms of what kids are looking for in high school. And a lot of times there is much more of a focus, just from speaking to friends in Israel, there's a much more of a focus on college for our kids. Mm-hmm. And there's a drive of I need to get it right. Right. So like, what do I write down? It's a very, and now our students, I think, are very used to it, but for sure, still now, and definitely for years, we struggled a lot with like, well, what's the right answer? What do I write down? Well, it's, so it's kind of the opposite, right? Like you're saying, that they're so tuned in. I also think that sometimes there's a sense of reflection fatigue, that it becomes almost, we have to be careful that we actually are learning real stuff, and it's not just about, well, you can write anything, right? That like you said, that totally subjective thing. Like I think that it is important what we learn, and I think that there are certain ideas. The reason why it is so important that we learn certain, whether it's certain psukim, certain Rambam, certain whatever, is because the ideas found in those texts are so important. And the reason they're so important is because they're life-changing. And the question is, okay, so how do we learn them and make them life-changing, is by bringing them in and seeing how do they apply. But I think that's a challenge, is to actually learn the stuff, and not just, well, you don't have to learn anything. We can just kind of like talk about ourselves a lot. So I think that is challenging. So I would say that the two main things is this like kind of, oh, you're asking us to reflect again, whereas really, it feels like fresh and different, and not like we're asking them to do the same thing over and over again. And that kind of intensity about, I need to get it right, versus those are two kind of almost opposite, really challenges, but they both exist.
All right, Yehuda, and I guess we'll end with this. So I
agree, and we'll just build off of that. That I mean, if you're asking, what the challenges are for American teenagers, and for modern Orthodox schools, I think, we're so outcome focused, right? We're so focused on externals, on are you preparing for college? Are you showing up for, even on the religious side, right? Because we're really focused on the college side. On the religious side, we know how to gauge, right, whether students are showing up to minyan outside of school, whether they're coming to a night sitter program that's happening in school, whether they are going to an NCSY Kollel or Machach Hesder or some kind of learning, extra learning program outside of school. And those metrics are all external, and they're all about, who are you with and what group are you doing it with? And I think the challenge, with that is that it makes religious practice and religious identity so much a focus of the group, and the context that I'm in. And there's a lot of power to that, and a lot of tremendous things that have been accomplished. But ultimately, I think to some extent we're on the opposite extreme of what's happening in Israel, right? Where we're so focused on the externals that we need to create space for people to build up their own individual connection. Because what happens 20 years later when you're not in yeshiva, you're not lucky like Rick and I are to live our entire lives in school, and now what's your personal connection? What's your personal connection to Torah? What's your personal connection to Gemara? And I think that's a challenge that I think why I'm so passionate about a lot of this work. On the other hand, I'm also concerned about what you're talking about. And I am a student of Rav Lichtenstein. And for me, the idea of mechuyavut and a sense of responsibility is a huge part of what inspires me to connect to Torah and to mitzvot. And I want to convey that to my students. And we want to make sure to keep that in our minds, right, all the time, that we're doing that as well. If someone like Rav Dov were to come and say, I have a process, I have a system, I have an approach for you to teach that mechuyavut, I would be jumping on that also and working on that too. And I think, that's a topic for future conversations, maybe future symposia as well. And I think that both of those are kind of components that we need to work on. But I'm not willing to say that because I want to make sure that there's that mechuyavut, I'm not willing to open up, right, types of questions that are going to be much more personal, right, and much more, to some extent, relative.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to wrap it up, I would say that what comes through from speaking to both of you is that if we're talking about Mahashevet Yisrael, what the two of you are describing is learning how to live Mahashevet Yisrael, right? Not just learning Mahashevet Yisrael, but living it. And I think that's just really powerful. And I think the power of it comes through in this conversation, both in your commitment to it and what you're doing with your students. So thank you very much on behalf of Tradition for having this conversation. Any last thoughts or words that either one of you would like to add?
I'll just say that what always strikes me when working with Rav Dov and with those who work with him is that this is a process that it's not a revolution. It's something that takes a very long time. And you know, you see his long white beard. And I think for me, that's always a symbol of this is not something that happens overnight. It's a long avodah.